So while you're here, before we get started, please share your name, where you're based, and the one question we've been asking folks one question at the beginning of each session. So question for this group of folks who are joining us here. If you could have dinner with anyone, living or dead, who would you have dinner with? So I'm David. I'm based in Boston. I think I would have dinner with Theodore Roosevelt because I've read a biography about him and thought he lived a very interesting life. Shanelle, who would you want to have dinner with?
Alex asked me this once, and I think I said Charlotte Bronte, and I think I stand by that because I am a basic woman who studied English.
I love it. I love it. All right. So for folks who are not familiar with Shanelle, Shanelle is a Jill of all trades marketer with a 15-year background in growth. By day, she's an experimentation and analyst lead at Shopify, the fastest growing SaaS company in history. You've probably heard about it. By night, she's a freelance writer in the conversion rate optimization space. You've probably seen her bylines on websites like CXL, Unbounced, VWO, and more. And she was recently named as one of the top experts in conversion rate optimization. So we're fortunate we get to learn from her and how we can build an experimentation program, run experiments that actually help us build knowledge and extract insights. So Shanelle, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Cool. So I'm going to chat through how to learn from experimentation and how to build a knowledge base and extract insights from it as you go. The first question to start us off, what is the value of a single experiment? I would say on average, not much. Most experiments are neutral or they result in a loss. And even when you do win, really all you've learned is what worked at one point in time for one part of the funnel for one audience. And if you're anything like me, you're like, cool, like, what do I do with this? Like, where do I go next? What does this mean for all of my different products or my different websites or my different geos? How do I apply this learning? That's just a snapshot of a point in time. So I think biasing towards a learning-centric experimentation program is the solution. And I think that starts with conducting quantitative and qualitative analysis to uncover some learnings to start. And that's where we'll kind of kick things off. So I'll just go through a couple of different types of analysis you can do to first like feed insights into your initial experimentation program. And then from there in the second half, we'll cover how to turn those experiments that you run from these insights into even more insights. Okay, so the first one is heuristic analysis. I will say that this is probably the least scientific and most subjective thing that I'll talk about today. But the principle here is that it doesn't have to be perfect. It's super fast and it might be good enough. It's good directionally, and done is better than perfect. Another caveat before we kind of dive into heuristic analysis and what you're looking for as you're going through, experience matters. And the more you do this and the more years you've been doing this, the better your insights will be that you're able to pull out of it. I think one thing to help guide you is to try to focus on a core set of principles that you're looking for as you're going through, so that you're not just kind of like calling out, hey, I don't like this, or this wouldn't be how I would have done it. Becoming every designer's like worst fear. So those principles that I like to follow, the first one is relevancy. And really what I'm looking for here as I'm going through different pages, it could be different apps that you're promoting, different emails, whatever marketing asset you're looking at. I'm looking for relevancy. So how well does each page match what the visitor thought they were going to see? And then number two, I'm looking for clarity. I think this is the biggest one. We tend to get very like insider baseball as we talk about our products, and we get very familiar with them, and people frankly just don't know what we're talking about half the time. Being clear is really important. This is the number one thing I would look for if you were going to prioritize any of the principles over any of the other ones. So we're looking for, is what's being offered and how it works perfectly clear on every page. The third one is motivation. This seems pretty obvious, but people need to be motivated to take your call to action. And often we don't put enough effort into making sure that our call to action is in fact motivating. So here we're looking for, are the motivators clear? Are they believable, timely, and persuasive? Number 4, friction. This is the one we've all probably heard about. What could be a source of fear or anxiety on each of these pages? How much friction exists and how can we reduce it? And then the 5th one is distraction. So here we're looking for, is anything directing the visitor away from your most wanted action? It's not inherently bad to have multiple calls to action on the same page or at the same asset, but we should be aware of how each of those calls to action detracts or distracts from all of the others, and make sure that we're prioritizing the one that's most important and most valuable to us in the business. And then I think it's also important to note that we should be doing heuristic analysis in a group setting. So if you do this by yourself, you'll probably get some insights, but again, it is a little bit more subject to subjectivity if you're just doing it alone. So I would encourage you to do it with multiple people, bring people in from different disciplines with different backgrounds, different areas of the business. You can bring in completely different opinions and different biases than you will. So moving away from some of the more subjective, less scientific stuff, move into quantitative research. This is where we're trying to figure out the what and figure out what actually happened. Essentially, we're looking to verify with data what we think we uncovered with the heuristic analysis, or if we had some like directional insights that we wanted to follow up on, we would now use the quantitative analysis to verify or disprove. Ideally disprove our own assumptions. That would be more valuable. So that's what we're going to look through here. But I think first, before you get into like funnel analysis and that sort of work, I would suggest doing technical analysis, which is basically just making sure your website, or again, whatever asset you're looking at, is functioning properly and the way that you think it is, which also sounds very obvious, but is very, very common. I would say most websites are broken in some capacity and in many capacities that you're not aware of. So this is just kind of a process to get us familiar with how your website is working and how it's not working and what the areas of opportunity are there. I'm going to go through Google Analytics screenshots for the most part, but I mean, this process is fairly similar across any digital analytics platform that you're working with, including probably any of your like first party tooling or data warehouse. It'll probably be pretty similarly structured. So here we're looking at the audience technology browser and OS report. And you'll see that I've switched from the default data view to the comparison view in the right-hand corner. And the reason that I've done that is so that you can actually see how that compares to other pages on the site by one metric. So here I'm looking by bounce rate, which is a hotly debated metric and maybe not the best one for me to use as an example. I would recommend whatever your conversion rate is, whether it's session to lead or session to customer or session to purchase or anything like that. So what we're asking the report to do is tell us how each browser compares to the average for this one metric. So effectively, we get a list of prioritized areas of opportunity. If the bar is red and large, we want to look into it. Importantly, though, we always want to compare within the same browser family. So I wouldn't look at Chrome versus Safari. I would click into Chrome and I would look within that browser family. I would look within the Chrome family at what you're performing better or worse, just so you get a more accurate idea of how that browser is performing. And then we move on to cross-device testing. Very similar concept here. We're just looking at cross devices instead of browsers. And for this report, I have the audience mobile devices view pulled up. Again, I have that comparison view switched on so I can see obvious areas of opportunity. And again, I would only compare within the same family. So I'm not going to compare that Google Nexus on the top to one of the Samsungs. I'm going to compare the Samsungs to one another. And I feel obligated to say that mobile is a completely different beast. It could be a whole talk on its own. People have written dozens and dozens of articles by one author on mobile and how the intentions, motivations, and context change as you move through different devices. And I think it's just important to call out that a good mobile UX is different than a good desktop UX, and you should be optimizing them differently, but we don't really have time to get into it beyond that. And then the final part of the technical analysis is speed analysis. I think we hear a lot that conversion rate is directly tied to the speed of your website. I think it's important to call out that typically that means compared to your page interactive time, which is seconds until the site is actually usable. A lot of the times we default to looking at page load time, which is seconds until every element on the page is done loading. Actually, what we're looking for is that page interactive time. So I think it's just important to call that out when you're looking at digital analytics. And then a quick rule of thumb, I think if your site loads in less than 3 seconds or less, you're probably not going to get a ton of conversion value from speeding up your site. If it's in that 4 to 7 seconds range, maybe you'll be able to get something out of it. I think this is really like the gold mine opportunity that we think it is when it's loading in 7 seconds or more. So I think that's just important to keep in mind. Definitely, if you have like a data team or an engineering team, definitely working with them on consistently improving the speed of your website will be a good investment. But in terms of a conversion impact, I would kind of bias towards these rules of thumb. And when you're kind of actually looking into the speed of your website, again, we're pulling up this comparison view report. I have behavior, site speed, and page timings here. And what I'm looking at is effectively all of the pages sorted by number of page views so that we have the most trafficked pages at the top. And then again, I'm just looking for that document interactive time or page interactive time. I'm looking how it compares to the site average, and effectively going down the red side, we're looking at a list of pages that we need to look into. I think this is really, really common on content assets, and I don't think we talk about it enough. As we add large pictures and videos, and we get long-winded for the sake of search engines and thoroughness for our readers, I think that the page load time tends to sneak up on us. I almost always find those large red bars to be top of funnel content assets. So I think that's particularly important to call out for folks who may be watching this. And then, I mean, honestly, my recommendation is probably to run all of your pages that you have listed out, run them through a simple free tool like PageSpeed. And then, you know, again, if you have that engineering or data science team on hand, you can reach out to them and work with them to try to get a list of recommendations for how to increase the speed. Okay, so that was the technical analysis. Now we can actually get into web analytics analysis. And here, I think the common problem is we're looking for just like, where do we start, right? When you open up Google Analytics, you have an internal data warehouse, you have third-party tools, there's a lot of data, and it's really hard to know what part of the data is actually useful and what can be made actionable. And I think it starts with a problem to solve or a question to answer and knowing what you're going to do with the answer to that question. So that's kind of where I try to center my exploratory analysis when I'm just kicking off and I'm like, where are the opportunities? I try to focus on a couple of questions, hopefully informed by the heuristic analysis that we've done and some of the technical analysis. Again, we're trying to consistently prove or disprove the assumptions we've made so far. I'm sorry for the Tony Robbins quote. This was incredibly cliche. I think also I would be remiss not to mention all of the common issues we have when setting up Google Analytics and any digital analytics tool. Again, using Google because it's very common, but it applies across the board. I think questions to ask yourself, are you collecting all of the data you need? Can you trust the data that you're actually collecting? And then is anything broken or tracking or reporting incorrectly? And if so, why? Would definitely recommend doing a health check at least annually to make sure that as you're adding new integrations and you're working with new data sets that you're not skewing any of the data and working off incorrect data. I think just to call out some common mistakes that are made, typically it's either pages are missing and not tagged, Data is different in the shopping cart tool, which applies to any third-party tool, again, that you may have integrated. And then 3, cross-domain tracking isn't working. So I would encourage you to use a checker to make sure that the latest code is on all of the pages on your website that you're trying to track. Look into any installation issues. Make sure your different third-party tools aren't reporting in different time zones, or that you didn't set up tracking midday, or that say like canceled transactions are showing in GA when they're not showing on your third-party tool, as an example. That was a very e-commerce focused example, but I think it applies across the board for any third-party tool that you're integrating with digital analytics. And then for cross-domain tracking, I think it's just a case of looking to make sure that cookie info is being shared with any other domains that you're working with, especially if you keep your blog or like academy or like top of funnel domain asset on a different domain or on a subdomain. Okay, I feel like all of my obligatory cautions are out of the way. So when I'm doing this analysis, I like to start with either high volume, low value pages or low volume, high value pages. So to me, a high volume, low value page is probably something like a blog post. It might get a ton of top of funnel traffic, maybe doesn't get a ton of conversions. Or low volume, high value pages. That could be like your checkout page, as an example. I like to start with the former. I spent a lot of years in content marketing, and so I'm a big fan of the value of content and how much it can be a conversion tool. So I like to start there at the top of the funnel. And so what I'm looking at here is effectively just a list of pages, again, by page view, and I'm comparing bounce rate or hopefully, a conversion metric by the average again. So I have that comparison view activated. You'll notice I have an advanced filter on. It's just a filter to filter out pages with too small of a sample size, or like, I think it was 3,000 page views or less. I just didn't care to analyze it, more or less. So essentially what you have here is a prioritized list of pages that you can look into and look for conversion opportunities. Again, biasing towards anything that is large and red in that right-hand column. And then I think 404 pages are always a great place to get started. Broken links are bad for SEO and they're bad for UX. So pulling up a list of all of your broken links and trying to fix them and resolve the issues is a really easy, low-hanging conversion opportunity. How I usually do that is to look for whatever my 404 page title is. I search for it. So in this case, page not found. And then when you click into that, you can use the full refer secondary dimension to see all of the URLs that are referring traffic to each of those pages. And you can also see all of the pages that are returning 404. And so again, I'm just like collecting lists of links that are areas that we should look into. And then when we get into auditing our funnel, so this is the funnel visualization report, again, in Google Analytics, not sponsored. The further down the funnel you go, the smaller the necessary impact you're going to have. So if you can have a 1% impact in that like review order page to sales confirmation part of the funnel, it's going to be outsized to like a 5% increase at the very top of funnel with add to cart. So again, if I'm prioritizing, I'm looking from the bottom up in this case. I tend to spend more time with this report than the previous one. So this is the goal flow report, and it shows the more accurate path to conversion. And also it's more flexible. So you can apply advanced segments. You can use date comparison here. It's not just like an always on, these are the buckets in your funnel. And I think this also helps you prioritize digging and optimization. You can start getting into like here I have the traffic source advanced segment on, so I can dig into, do we want to analyze specifically for people coming from CJ, which is affiliate traffic? Do we want to draw conclusions about that specific audience? This is where I think we can get more granular with with our insights. And then there's also the reverse goal path, which I think is very cool, because I think in marketing, we necessarily have these very simplified versions of the funnel. It's easier to communicate, it's easier to plan around, it's easier to staff around. But we all kind of like just secretly know that that's not actually how people convert, and it's usually a much more complicated process, and people don't progress in a linear fashion from point 1 in the funnel to point 2. And so the reverse goal path report shows you actual funnels. And I think you'll discover a lot of funnels that you didn't even know existed, let alone that you knew that you should be optimizing for. And then I think the final one for quantitative analysis, or like digital analytics analysis, is kind of looking into your internal search. If you have an internal search on your site, which you probably do if you're running a blog or any sort of content heavy website, with some digging, you can effectively find what people are looking for that you are not showing them, which can also inform your editorial calendar. And also, and if you're doing like content refreshes or content updates or anything like that, this can inform what you should add in to your existing articles, and can also help if you have an SEO team, or if you're doing the SEO research yourself, it can help you inform some of your digging with search engine optimization as well. And then my final caveat here is that I think segmentation is the most important part of any quantitative analysis, and that too could be its own talk. It would take 20 minutes to get through, so we don't have time to get into it fully here. I've written a couple articles on it, and I'm happy to share. But I think the way you kind of slice and dice your data is where you're going to find the most value. So once you've kind of dug through Google Analytics, I feel like the other aspect of quantitative analysis that we talk about often in CRO and content is click maps and scroll maps. My hot take is that they're not that useful, but they look really nice. And so I'm hoping that I can kind of give you insight into how to actually extract value, and where you can find that information, probably just in your digital analytics tool. So click maps, I think in particular, are the least useful in my opinion. Most of this info is available in Google Analytics if you go to the navigation summary, and if you've set up all of your click tracking in your digital analytics tool, you should just be able to see this information, and also click in and apply filters and get more information. I think where it's actually valuable is that you can see when people are clicking on things that are not currently linked, which can give you some insight on maybe this isn't clear, they wanted more information, and you can integrate that into your page design. Scroll maps are very similar. I think they're most useful for prioritizing your content and your messaging. If you see any drastic color change that strays from the typical like drastic change below the fold, you might want to look into that and see if perhaps you have a false bottom where people think the page has ended, or if that information just isn't as interesting to them. And then the last one is form analytics. So again, you can probably set this up in your digital analytics tool, but there are also separate form analytics tools that you can use. Here, I think the most valuable questions to ask would be which form fields are causing the most error messages, which ones are people hesitating to fill out, and then which do people leave empty, even if it's clear that they're required. And I think those 3 analysis questions will lead you to the majority of your insights for form analytics. Okay, so now finally, we'll get into qualitative research. I think this is the fun part. I think it's cool to know what happened, but I think all of the insights and all of what feeds into your experimentation program, in my opinion, comes from the qualitative research. And it's just fun understanding how people browse your website. So the first thing I would suggest here is session replays. I like them because they're real people with real money who are actually looking to spend it potentially on your product. And so I like to look for where they pause, where they give up, and then use that to gather more insight on poor performers. So any of the websites that we listed in the previous sections, they were like, hey, we should look into this later. I am pulling up that list and I'm doing session replays on those pages in particular to try to see what's broken and what's not working. Session replays are very time consuming, so I would try to prioritize it as much as possible. But they're very interesting. I had a mentor who told me that when he showed me session replays, I was like, this is so cool. And this is so cool. I'm going to do this for hours. And he's like, you'll get so sick of this so quickly. And I never did. It's very interesting. So I really encourage you to check it out and watch how people are actually using your website. And then we get into on-site surveys. I kind of like mentally categorize them into exit surveys when people are showing intent to leave your website, or on-page surveys when they're still happy frolicking on your website. I don't know if this is like an official delineation between the two, but that's how it makes sense in my brain. And I think that they're the two most impactful times to kind of ask on-site survey questions. Generally, when I'm looking in an on-site survey, I'm looking to identify actionable data based largely around that friction principle that we talked about when we were looking at heuristic analysis. So I'm not really interested in who they are, or like demographic information, or why they're here intrinsically, or like what their motivation or purpose is. I'm really looking for very tactical, like, why are you on this website and what were you looking to get done? And then were you able to complete it? And if not, why? Or do you have any unanswered questions? Is there anything holding you back? Is there anything you were unable to find? Those types of questions I find most helpful at this level of the funnel, when they don't really owe you anything, you don't really know anything about them. And then I think because you don't really know anything about them and they don't really owe you anything, they're not customers, you don't have a relationship, it's best to keep it to one open-ended question, or a like sneaky yes/no question with an optional explanation post-answer. So if they say no, then you can say why optionally after they say yes or no. I again find this particularly helpful for content resources. I'm very interested if the people who ended up finding and reading my content actually found it useful and what was missing from the content. It's a great way to get very specific feedback that you can then feed into either yourself, if you're the SEO person, or your SEO team, so they can try to better align keywords with content. And then like the sister of on-site surveys is customer surveys. I like to stick to talking to first-time buyers. I think that there is the most insight to find there and most actionable information. And I like that they have no previous relationship with you. So they're not biased by previous interactions. And again, much like session replays, it's very time consuming to go through these, especially if you have a lot of open-ended questions. You're going to be sorting through and trying to categorize a lot of different answers. So I try to shoot for about 200 responses and cap it there. You will find additional things beyond 200, don't get me wrong, but I think you'll effectively reach the point of like diminishing returns at around 200. And then here, we're looking for the opposite of what we were looking for in the on-site surveys, right? Like I'm looking for, who are you? What are you using this for? What problem does this solve for you in your personal life? What do you like about it the most? Did you consider alternatives? I want to like kind of get at their buying journey or their conversion journey, right? If you're not in e-commerce, you're not selling a product. If you're doing more like lead gen work, just swap out product for anything related to a conversion or any sort of lead gen. And I think what we really want to focus on is either the value that you're delivering or the friction that the person perceived as they were going through your funnel. And then finally, I really recommend user testing. You can do it super formally or you can do it really informally. I often, specifically for content assets, I've just reached out to readers and asked if I could watch them try to navigate the blog or watch them try to navigate Academy or any of our content assets, try to find specific pieces of content, see how hard the UX is, see how they try to navigate content and how they fail to navigate content so that we can use that to inform the UX of the website. I think you'll find that it's very humbling. Often we intend for people to use our website with those little gates that they made you get off your bike and walk through when you were a kid, and everyone just rode around really quickly. I think you'll find a lot of those journeys as you're going through. And I think user testing is probably the most obvious way to identify the little dirt paths on your website. When you're going through, I find it most useful to ask them for a specific task, like find a video game that is a first-person shooter under $60, and a broad task like find a video game you like, and then a funnel completion of asking them to actually check out or actually complete the purchase, and just watch as they try to complete those tasks without further guidance. I think is very, very important that you just watch, you listen, you don't ask for their opinions. Unfortunately, you don't help them when they ask for help. They'll probably get frustrated and want guidance or additional information or additional context. And I think it's really important that you sit and observe and try to be an objective party. Okay, so that is how you initially get a list of insights and learnings that you can use to fuel your experimentation program, to kick it off and get it started from 0 to nothing. But then we're still left with this unanswered question that we kind of visited at the beginning, which is, what is the value of a single experiment? And how do you scale your learnings from those single experiments into an experimentation program that is more than the sum of its parts, or more than each individual experiment that you run? I think first, it's important that we emphasize that if you did effective experimental design and pre-analysis, every experiment you run is valuable, regardless of the outcome. If it was positive and you won big, that's a good result. If it was negative and you lost, that was a good result. And if it was neutral, that was also a good result. As long as they all level up to an action that we can take next, it was a good experiment. Either we ship it and we push the new variant that we've designed or the intervention to production, or we roll it back and we iterate on our hypothesis, or we iterate on the intervention that we ideated, or we try something completely new. As long as you've taken an action from that experiment, it was a good experiment. Unfortunately, a lot of experiments are not designed this way. And so we get into this like win-loss culture where either you win and it's good, or you lose and it's bad. So we're trying to avoid that as much as possible. As an example, if it's positive, you could run a V2 or run another experiment in that series to validate the results and try to identify a pattern that's at play here. You could roll out to production, as we mentioned. If it's negative, you could look into some of the behavioral analytics that we went through at the quantitative analysis section when we were looking at Google Analytics. And you could try to inform a new hypothesis based on the negative results that you're seeing. If it's neutral, I mean, you know what is or isn't influential now, right? Maybe like whatever you were testing or whatever lever you were trying to pull isn't super influential, and it might not be an area that you should continue pursuing, especially if you get a lot of neutral results in a row. Or it could just be assigned to iterate on the hypothesis and make sure that it isn't a lever you should be trying to pull. So I think it's important that we all align on the idea that the data impresses no one. My favorite movie is The Prestige. Actually, my favorite movie is The Devil Wears Prada, but I say it's The Prestige when I want to sound cooler and more edgy. But The Prestige is about magicians, and one of my favorite lines is, "The secret impresses no one. The trick you use it for is everything." And I think that's really relevant to experimentation. I spend a lot of time thinking about data and how it works, right? Like I'm thinking, is the experiment data passing correctly? Are the assignments being made evenly? How are we defining metrics? Does everyone agree with how we're defining metrics? And I think very few people care about data as much as my team and I care about data. And I think that's probably true in your organization as well. In working in data, I have realized and come to the conclusion that the data impresses no one, and we need to show them the trick. We need to show them how to use it. So keeping with this analogy, I think the archive or your experiment archive is like your magician's hat that you pull the rabbit out of. And if it's not full of data and secrets, you can't pull anything valuable out of it. So it's important that we fill it. And we archive experiments, one, to avoid running tests repeatedly by mistake. It's not inherently a mistake to run a test twice, but it is if we don't know that we're running it twice and we're doing it by accident. And it happens very, very often, much more often than you think. Number two, to easily communicate wins and insights. If we're not archiving it and we're not saving these insights somewhere, it's really, really hard to put together a deck for stakeholders, for your exec team, for an article that you're writing to share out your insights and your wins. Number three, to improve the quality of future tests. If you don't keep an archive of where you've been, you're not going to be able to inform a smarter version of where you could go. And then number four, to create that like insights over wins culture that we talked about, to avoid falling into the trap of like, okay, if it won, then that's good and we all celebrate. And if it lost, we just like quietly don't say anything or talk about experimentation for months until we win again. So we want to avoid that and create an insights culture. And we can't do that if we're not archiving the insights. So the next question is what goes into an archive, right? Like what do you need to actually record? I think at minimum, if you keep track of what ran, when, and why, you'll be ahead of most people who are running experiments and trying to scale experimentation programs. But I think there are a few other things it would be great if you could also track. So this one is a bit of a hot take. I personally think that you should include all types of measurement and research in your archive. So, experimentation is just a form of measurement. It's a very rigorous form of measurement, but it's no different than most other types of measurement and research. So why not keep all of those different formats together and in one archive? So that would be my recommendation. And I would also recommend highlighting the like TLDR or too long didn't read, as well as the recommendation. So probably you and a couple of people on your team are going to be the only people actually going through the archive later. And you are going to thank yourself when there's a nice little TLDR and recommendation at the top, maybe like a metrics table where you can just see at a glance how everything did. And people who are not you and your team, who are even like a step removed from experimentation, are really going to thank you. And then I think the last part, the part that I would say maybe 5% of people who experiment do that I have seen is pulling out the so what, or pulling out the pattern that exists, right? It's that analysis layer that exists. It's one thing to get it all in one place. It's another thing to have it all in one place and know what it means. So I know I just recommended that you kind of include all forms of research and analysis and measurement in your archive, but on the experimentation side, your experiment brief is probably going to be the foundation of your archive. And I think a common question is what goes in the brief? What do we need to record? So I would recommend start, cool down, and end dates, your experiment objective, the audience, location, region, and type of experiment. So like, are we running a standard A/B test? Are we looking at an incrementality test, a geo test? Are we doing diff and diff analysis or pre and post? Like what type of experiment are we running? And then we get into the metrics of like our decision metric, our monitoring metrics, and our guardrails, as well as information about the variants. So a description of each variant that you could deduce what is different between the two without screenshots, as well as screenshots, and the percent split. So it was at 50-50 as an example. And then number 6, our methodology. So, how are we making assignments? What is the grain? What are our experiment IDs? Our pre-analysis, I think this is another important one. So like, what was the opportunity size going in? What did we think our minimum detectable effect would be? What were our risks and limitations? And then, I think great experimental design is often a group project. And so like, who designed the experiment and who peer reviewed it? And, who else was involved? What other roles were involved in the creation of the experiment? And then, of course, links to designs, dashboards, GitHub issues, anything else that goes along with the experiment. So kind of making the experiment brief the center, or like the brain and hub of the experiment. Okay, so I will get less abstract and hypothetical and give some examples of great experiment archives, in my humble opinion. I have a screenshot here that is like somewhat redacted, I'm sorry, but that gives you an idea of how we track some experiments in growth. So what we're looking at is effectively like a roll-up of all the experiments that are running at any given time. And then you can also click into tabs for each of the teams that are running experiments. If you just want to filter by team, we have the experiment name, team name, the stage, champions, or who's running the experiment, the surface that it's running on, the subject type, start date, and then it cuts off. It asks most of the questions that we just went through in the brief slide. So what we're looking to do here is kind of create the behavior of archival from inception, right? So instead of asking people to do this like extra step at the end of the experiment, we're building it into the process for launching an experiment. So in creating a line in this spreadsheet, you are effectively starting to build a living archive. We're using Google Tables here. You could use Airtable, you could use a spreadsheet, you could use anything. In some cases, you can use your experiment tool or your experiment platform as well. Although my hot take again is that most of them only cover from like launch to conclusion. And there's a lot of pre-work that happens, and there's usually some additional post-analysis that happens outside of the platform. So I like to still include a tracker to keep everyone organized from ideation to next action. And then I think another way to kind of package archive analysis is to kind of develop evidence-based UX patterns or just patterns in general. We keep track of patterns that have been tested multiple times and are shown to have a consistent impact, whether it's positive or negative. And then that can include like layouts, colors, copy, kind of like threads that we're pulling at, or like questions that we have and we're chasing down the answer to. And so we list out the UX pattern, we list out our confidence level in that, very like subjective in the sense that it's either like low, medium, or high. I'm not talking about like actual statistical confidence. And then the evidence that we have. So again, that could be research, it could be analysis, it could be experiments, but we're keeping track of it so that if a PM or a growth marketer comes in and wants more information and they want to know, you know, like I'm building a new landing page, what do I need to know about landing pages? Or like, what do I need to know about this audience or this product? They can come to a page like this and pull out insights without sifting through the entire archive. And then I think my last example for how you can kind of add that analysis layer onto an archive is actual like ad hoc reports. So in that case, we're typically looking at a specific surface, like the website or an app or the product itself. And then we're looking at it during a specific time period. So in this example, I have, based on analysis of experiments run on Surface in 2021, there are several key insights that we think could improve both the speed and rigor of experiments while also improving the aim of future experiments. So like those experiments getting smarter next time. I listed out, since this is in TLDR format, listed out like 3 key insights. And then notably also have suggestions for future interventions and future hypotheses that we can chase down. I will go on one slight tangent about intervention category. I think when stakeholders are coming to you, or when you're coming to yourself and asking yourself, like, what is most important right now? What do I need to know about what I'm learning from experimentation? I find that you're going to be asking questions about either the intervention category. So like, what type of intervention did you make? Was it related to copy or the navigation or the call to action? And the other one is surface. So like, again, what are we learning about this specific surface or this specific asset? What are we learning about content? What are we learning about blogs? So I think if you proactively tag all of your experiments with intervention category, surface, geo, all of these things that we've suggested in the brief section, it'll be really, really easy to pull out these insights later on. It's really, really hard to do it after the fact and after it's already run. So again, the secret impresses no one. The trick you use it for is everything. I think the magic trick that we perform as experimenters is turning experiments into action. It's pulling out the trick. And archive analysis is the action of analyzing experiment data and translating that into next steps. And that was my very long 30 minutes. I'm so sorry. Is there any questions?
Shanelle, that was so dense with info. Thank you so much for that. I'm really glad you didn't brush over the basics. Like, ironically, I told you that like we just had a buggy website and things didn't work. So I'm very glad you brought up like, hey, just before you go into any fancy experimentation or anything, just make sure everything's working as planned. I know for a lot of folks who are joining us, they sit on content and are typically working on a marketing side rather than in product. And they're always thinking about how to improve conversions from content. I think you mentioned the blog a couple of times. So maybe this might be a very basic or silly question, but I'm kind of marrying your background in content to kind of where you are now in experimentation, but what sort of questions or surveys would you put on a blog to understand how to optimize that for conversions? Because you mentioned like asking questions on like content assets.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, in my actual experience, I have mostly done surveys with content to understand how I could potentially improve the content or like inform the keyword strategy better. And so like questions of, did this answer your question? If it's coming from, especially if it's coming from like a question keyword as an example, then I can pass that back to the SEO team, or again, myself if I'm doing the SEO as well. I haven't used it extensively for conversions outside of actual like customer survey. So again, I'm using customer, but I just mean reader. I put together, actually, when I was trying to like prove the value of conversion optimization and advocate for it being something that we did at Shopify, I was on the content team and I put together a conversion research report going through all of these steps just for the blog assets. And I really, truly to this day believe that the idea that blogs and content don't directly convert is a myth, and people are just not applying the same rigor and the same measurement and like getting the same resources that product teams get. And I think that all of this is very transferable to content.
Yeah, that's really awesome to hear. I know a lot of folks, when they think of content, they think of like just getting a lot of traffic and maybe like 0.2% of that will convert into a lead, but that's one way of doing content, not the only way. So I appreciate you just said that. So I had a couple questions because I'm very curious about all of this. I see those page speed tools a lot. I use them for like our websites and for clients every now and then. From my experience, it seems impossible to get like 100 out of 100 score. How much do you index on those? Like, is there a barrier where you're like, this is good enough?
Yeah, there totally is. And I think that's like I think it's a biased opinion in that I'm usually looking at it from a conversion perspective. Like I know engineering colleagues who would be like, no, like every millisecond counts. We need to keep like doing this. It's going to have a bigger impact. And I'm like, well, probably not on the conversion side. And so I think for me anyways, there's a certain level of commitment or interest I have in speed analysis and speed improvements, thinking that it's going to be like a big win for conversion. That's why I kind of I hate a rule of thumb, but like that's why I tried to give the rule of thumb about if it's under this, you're probably not going to get like exponential value out of optimizing it.
Yeah. All right, that's helpful. And then you mentioned session replays are a pretty big part of your research, and I've done them myself, and it's true. You can just sit there for hours watching them, and honestly, sometimes getting frustrated that they click on the wrong thing. But what are some examples of experiments where you use session replays as part of your research? Like, how do you decide how many you're going to watch before you like come to a conclusion?
Yeah, for sure. As I'm going through them, I try to take notes of things that come up more than once, which is, I'm sure there are some things that I miss doing that, but I feel like I'm really looking for not what did one person struggle with, but what did people repeatedly struggle with. I think my favorite example of using it to inform an experiment was I'm going to butcher all of these names because I don't know the proper terminology, but it was an e-commerce site, and we were looking at some of the product filters down the left-hand side. So all of the product listings were on the right, and then all of the filters were on the left-hand side, and they were very, very confusing. People were collapsing them when they were trying to click them. You couldn't like select more than one at a time, and we just found a ton of problems with how people were or were not able to use the filters. And I think we watched like 10 of them, and I was like, this is a huge problem, and everyone was like, it's not that big of a problem. And then I showed I just showed one of the replays of someone like trying to add a filter to the e-commerce results, and then I got buy-in to run an experiment, and it had a huge increase, and we changed the UX of the website.
Yeah, it makes such a difference, because you probably could have figured that out just qualitatively going on a website yourself, but when you have the recording of someone struggling that much, no one can argue against that. So I love that.
For sure. And I think also like we get used to using our own websites. Like I think there are some things that I've worked at Shopify for almost 6 years. Like I'm just so used to how things work on the website. And I'm like, of course I don't realize how much I'm correcting or like how many coping mechanisms I've created to navigate it. And also like, I think we're biased in that I'm sure many of us work in tech, and, you know, like I joke that I was raised by the internet. Like I just know things about the internet. And there were a lot of people I spoke to who read, say, the Shopify blog that were not raised by the internet, and they didn't know like what a blog was or how to access it when it wasn't coming through the email that they got every week. And I was blown away. Like, I think we take for granted how much knowledge we have just being around tech all the time.
Yeah, it's kind of something I've ranted about before, where a lot of marketers are sort of like, "Oh, email is dead" or whatever. And I'm like, it's dead because a lot of marketers are saying that, but a lot of email still works. A lot of people still love emails. A lot of people still print PDFs and download ebooks and like print them out. So a lot of the things that kind of in our marketing bubble we hear is actually not relevant to a lot of folks.
Yes.
It's a great reminder. So I think those are all the questions. Shanelle, thanks so much for taking the time to walk us through this entire process and how you extract insights from experiments. I learned a lot, so really appreciate you taking the time. To everyone else, we have day 3 of Road to Mastery tomorrow. So join us for sessions with Brian Massey, who's going to share how to get started with A/B testing, and Joanna Wiebe on how to turn voice of customer into copy. See y'all tomorrow. Take care, Shanelle.
Bye. Thank you. You too.
Bye.